Good afternoon. It is November 7th. This is a WorldOregon webinar, The Election in Brazil. What does it mean for democracy? And we have with us today Shawn Smallman. Before we get to the program, I want to make a couple announcements, tell you about some upcoming things, give you a little bit of housekeeping. We haven't had a program for a little bit. We are jumping back into the fray. And as I keep saying to people, we are beginning to tiptoe back into the town square with some in-person programming as well, including this week. This Thursday, we have an in-person program with Mel Gertoff, who is a perennial favorite with WorldOregon audiences. If you don't know Mel, for many years, he taught at Portland State University. He also has as his claim to fame, among many others, being an incredible resource on China and Korea. He is the co-author of the Pentagon Papers with Daniel Ellsberg. He is returning to discuss his new book, Engaging China, which is a rich and wide-ranging look at the many facets of China that worry critics. And he's going to discuss how the US can fine-tune its approach to bilateral relations. This is going to be Thursday, 6 p.m. in the Hatfield Room, just adjacent to our offices downtown Portland. And you can register for this at worldoregon.org. Also coming up, the WorldOregon Global Classroom is developing in collaboration with our Education Advisory Council a series of fantastic professional development opportunities for educators. They're going to have two culturally relevant teaching educator working groups in 2022 and 2023, one on sparking and sustaining connections through student voice, and the other on engagement in the humanities through student interest, inquiry, and bravery. And you can find out more of that on our website at worldoregon.org. And if you are a regular with WorldOregon programs, I wanted to give you a save the date that Great Decisions will be back in person and will begin January 20th, which is Friday at noon, as it has been as long as I've been here, and I think since writing was invented. We've been doing Great Decisions since 1953, and it's in no danger of going away anytime soon. The topics this year are fantastic. So mark your calendar and join us at noon, Fridays after the new year. Very excited to have with us Shawn Smallman today. Shawn is a professor at Portland State University, and I believe way back when, in April 2020, as the world pivoted into the cloister and the containment of the pandemic, Shawn, I believe, was our first virtual program. Oh. He did a program for us on COVID, fact, fear, and fiction, on what we knew, what we didn't know, and where we thought it might be going. And boy, howdy, did any of us realize how long it would be, where it would go, and what we would be doing today. But yet again, here we are doing a virtual program, which I'm very, very happy to offer, because it is a way to reach people not only in our own backyard, but across the strait, across the nation, and pretty much wherever you can stream something intergalactically. So I'm excited that Shawn is with us today. He's done programs for us in the past on Brazil, and he's got some wonderful experience in that region. When the elections happened, a week or so ago, I immediately recognized that this was a very, very pivotal moment to look at. And one of my favorite things to do with our programs is be able to react quickly, to have a rapid response, look at something that is happening in the world that gets us, beyond the headline, below the fold, beyond the scroll, and lets us basically, peel the curtain back on a big issue. So just to get us going, Shawn is a professor of international and global studies at Portland State University, who has done work on global health, civil military relations, Latin American and indigenous issues. In his first book, Fear and Memory in the Brazilian Army and Society, studied the breakdown of democracy in Brazil. He then wrote The AIDS Pandemic in Latin America, based on field work in Brazil, Cuba, and Mexico, with such diverse groups as drug traffickers and addicts, sex workers, people living with HIV, and doctors. He also co-authored a textbook with Professor Kim Brown titled An Introduction to International and Global Studies. The book is now in its third edition, and most recently, he has written articles about conspiracy theories in both public health and politics. In 2019, he won the PSU College of Urban and Public Affairs Researcher of the Year Award, and we are happy to have Shawn with us today. So Shawn, without further ado, the floor is yours. Throughout the program, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function on your screen, and I will jump in at the end and we will have a little bit of a dialogue. So Shawn, go to it.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. That was a wonderful introduction. And I'm going to try to be fairly short. I'll try to talk for about a half hour and leave lots of time for questions. Just a little bit about myself and my connection to Brazil. I've been working on Brazil and thinking about Brazil for about 30 years ago. As Tim mentioned, that I did work on civil-military relations in Brazil and the breakdown of democracy, and kind of thought that my research wouldn't be relevant anymore, but here we are. You know, I gave a talk on Brazil almost 10 years ago, and at that time, Brazil was seen as an emerging power. It was just such a very, very different moment from when I was in Brazil in the 1990s. At that time, inflation was 1,800% a year, which meant that when you changed your money, you had to spend it within a week because it was worth half as much at the end of the week as it was at the start. And you could see like people sitting and just going through their wallet, throwing out old bills, because you could have a stack of bills this thick and that would get you all of maybe a bus ride around the center. So in 2015, say, we were in such a different place. I mean, Brazil had gone through some really significant growth. Oil deposits have been discovered off the coast of Rio de Janeiro. There was real meaningful progress in improving social inequality. And so one of the questions I want to address with this is what went wrong that we got to this place where the country was so polarized during this last election. As many of you have probably seen, the difference between the winning candidate and the losing candidate in last week's presidential election was 2%. The country is profoundly divided. And yet, what we're seeing is a peaceful transition of power. So I want to talk about how did Brazil get to this point, and why did the election go off without a coup, without a major crisis? How is this transition happening? In order to talk about that, I want to say a little bit both about the previous president, or rather the current president until January 2023, and the incoming president. And maybe I'll say a little bit about the military as well, since that's my area of expertise. Why wasn't there a coup? But maybe I'll start by saying a few words about why this matters. Brazil is the largest economy in Latin America. Its GDP is bigger than that of Russia. It is the 5th most populous country globally. It has over 200 million people. If you look at just the state of Sao Paulo alone, it has about double the population of Guatemala, which is the most populous country in Central America. And the whole country of Brazil is about the same size, just a little bit smaller than the United States if you include Alaska. So it's got the most powerful armed forces in Latin America. It's the most powerful country in Latin America. And what we've just seen is part of a larger trend in the region, in which from Chile to Colombia, you've seen leftist, left-leaning politicians come into power. And this is, it's a really interesting moment in Brazilian history. And in order to kind of put it in context, you have to understand a couple of key figures, one of whom is President Jair Bolsonaro, who was a army officer in the 1980s, later became a politician, who is famous for making outrageous statements. For example, he's attacked women's rights, LGBTQ rights, environmentalists. He was elected to the presidency in 2018, came to power in 2019 after his predecessor, Dilma Rousseff, had been impeached. And if you look at the forces that gave Bolsonaro this opportunity, the car wash scandal, a political scandal surrounding the Workers' Party, the corruption in both the left-wing Workers' Party, but also in many of the traditional right-wing parties, as well as the attention that Venezuela's political and economic collapse has received. These all combine to create a very different political climate from, maybe a decade before, even from, say, 2015. Brazilians, I think it's fair to say, were exhausted by a long line of political scandals that had left one previous president impeached and another in prison. And it was the kind of context where anyone who would make really powerful and outrageous statements about shutting down Congress would get attention. And it was also the case that Lula's party, the Workers' Party, didn't really come across as denouncing examples of corruption within their own party. So when I remember in 2005 talking to someone who'd been one of the founding members of the Workers' Party, and he was disillusioned even then with his own party. He felt that there was just a failure to acknowledge the challenge that corruption represented for the party. And there was also a sense that Brazil was off the rails. In 2018, if I remember the date correctly, the National Museum burned down in Rio de Janeiro. And this was an incredible loss, fossils of dinosaurs, records of extinct languages, all kinds of historic documents that graduate students were using to write their theses. They all disappeared almost overnight. And I think many Brazilians kind of saw this as being emblematic of a larger issue in which basic governance wasn't being taken care of. Basic things weren't happening. And it just created this mood of hopelessness, I might say, disillusionment, frustration that really swept the country. At the same time, I think we would all probably recognize that Bolsonaro's election was also part of a larger trend in which people were turning towards populist leaders globally. And one of the things that people liked about Bolsonaro is that he tested existing political rules. I wrote an article, this was probably in the 1990s, that was talking about political corruption in Brazil. And I ended the article by quoting Bolsonaro. And at the time, he was, to be honest, I thought he was kind of a clownish almost figure. And he had this quotation I used that was something like this. It's not exactly these words, but more or less, what Brazil needs is to take 30,000 corrupt politicians to line them up against the wall and to shoot them all. And that, to me, kind of encapsulates the sort of rhetoric that Bolsonaro is known for. And he's someone who has had the same demeanor, the same sort of modus operandi for decades. I wouldn't say that there's been any dramatic changes. And to give a sense of how this sort of rhetoric, this sort of position, both divided Brazil, but also united the political right, I want to talk about COVID for just a few minutes. And I could talk about many things. I could talk about indigenous rights, LGBTQ rights. I could talk about the Amazon, but to me, his approach to COVID sort of embodied his entire administration. And from the start, Bolsonaro was very dismissive of COVID. This is despite the fact that he got COVID himself fairly early on, and despite the fact that Brazil had a terrible crisis with COVID, particularly in the Amazon region. If you look at the first, say, 6 to 8 months, more or less, of the pandemic, Brazil had more deaths than any other country globally, except for the United States alone. And in the Amazon, there was such a severe crisis around COVID that at one point they were burying 5 people to a coffin. And so there was just a lot of questioning, I guess it's fair to say, around the government's response to COVID. And there was a real loss of confidence by healthcare professionals in the government. Part of that was that there were a whole series of corruption cases everywhere from, for example, in the government of Rio de Janeiro, it was investigated for misappropriated funds for ventilators. And I think if I remember right, the deputy health minister in Rio de Janeiro was arrested in a corruption scheme that involved the purchase of about 1,000 ventilators. 2 health ministers were fired in the space of, I think it was a little more than a month. One of them, Nelson Teich, he announced his resignation on WhatsApp and then refused to answer any questions from reporters. And he was supposedly unhappy because the president was promoting the use of hydrochloroquine as an unproven drug that could be used to treat COVID. And the president said that he wanted to see new guidelines issued for the use of hydrochloroquine. And I think that the next day his health minister resigned, and it was either that same day or the next day that there was the first sort of peer-reviewed study that came out of the drug that was sort of larger scale and found that people were much more likely to die if they used hydrochloroquine. When he resigned, the previous health minister only tweeted, "Let us pray." And there was just this sense that things were a little out of control. And if you want to know what's really happening in Brazil, there's a Brazilian comedy program that you can find on YouTube. It's called Porta dos Fundos, and doorway to the depths, doorway to hell, maybe. I'm not quite sure how to best translate it, but it's vulgar, it's irreverent, and everybody watches it. And they had this whole kind of comedy series in which a series of health ministers were fired, and each one would come in, they'd be halfway through making their announcement that they were the new health minister, and then they'd say something wrong that displeased the president and they'd be fired. And each one seemed vaguely less qualified. Like the second to last one obviously was like a janitor. It was in a janitor's uniform and was like, well, I was just cleaning up outside when they called me in, and then he said something wrong and then he was gone. And the last person was just this police officer like screaming into the camera. And so this kind of captured a sense that there was some chaos. At one point early on when Bolsonaro was getting a lot of criticism that he wasn't doing anything, and yet the hospitals were filled with COVID patients, he said that he didn't really believe that this was real, and that he asked his supporters to take cameras, video cameras, into the hospitals and to see, are they really filled? And are these patients really sick with COVID-19? You can imagine how doctors, sort of nurses, responded to the idea that people should be pouring into the hospitals in the COVID wards. And to make things even worse, this is sort of an echo maybe of the Watergate scandal in the United States. Somebody recorded a presidential cabinet meeting during this period where they were talking about COVID, and one of Bolsonaro's supporters said that they should take advantage of the crisis to run cattle through the Amazon. And this recording, the president was using a lot of profanity. It actually was released by a judge, if I remember right. Really helped to kind of create just the sense that things were, the situation was being manipulated. But at the same time, there was a fraction of the population, a very large fraction, that also believed that COVID was being manipulated by liberal groups to push through policies that were dangerous, that information about effective drugs to treat COVID was being covered up, and that COVID was being used as a political opportunity maybe to undermine democracy. So I think it's fair to say half the country was really alienated by Bolsonaro, half the country really rallied to him. And this was the same for all kinds of different issues. So this is the outgoing president, Jair Bolsonaro. Then you have the incoming president, Lula. Lula's already governed Brazil. He was the president of Brazil from 2003 through 2010. And he was the old leader of the Workers' Party. He has a very strong working class background. His first job was actually as a shoeshine boy. He wound up joining the, well, he was one of the key figures in the Workers' Party who organized resistance to military rule. He worked as a metal worker, then became a union leader. And his election in 2003 really brought a sense of joy to his proponents and a sense of fear to conservatives. But in both of his elections, he won by a large margin. I want to say a little bit over perhaps 20 percentage points, very different from this election where he won by about 2. And if you were to look at the policies that he implemented, he had one key issue, which was fighting social inequality. He, for example, he had a program, Cesta Básica and the Bolsa Familiar, in which if parents kept their kids in school, their kids got all their vaccines, they could get access to certain resources, including food. Child malnutrition fell by almost half. There was real progress with inequality. In terms of foreign affairs, Lula very much prioritized relationships with other South American countries in the past, in part because of this linguistic divide between Portuguese and Spanish. Brazil had not really connected with the region the same way that you might expect, and it had prioritized the United States and Europe in its foreign affairs. Lula was very dedicated to turning this around. So there was also corruption. For example, one day in 2005, I was in Sao Paulo and I walked out of my house and there's all these people walking towards me down the street and they're all chanting, "We all want underwear like that. We all want underwear like that." And I thought there's something really wrong with my Portuguese. Obviously, underwear must have another meaning, or maybe underwear is some kind of political metaphor in Brazilian culture. And then I get a little closer, or they get a little closer, and I notice they're all waving sticks, and the sticks have underwear on the end. And I was so confused. And it turns out this was tied to something called the Mensalão scandal. And a man had, if I remember right, I think he was at the airport, and he was found to have over $100,000, I think, stuffed into his underwear, like you do. And his defense was something like, well, you know, with banks these days, who's going to use a check? And people believed that this figure was tied to Lula and that he was basically a bag man. That is, he's someone who kind of carries the money around and pays off people. And this was a huge scandal, like in 2005, around that period. It lingered on throughout all of Lula's presidency. But at the time, Brazil was growing. Lula had such a large mandate. The economy was doing well. And people sort of, I won't say they shrugged it off, but it didn't bring Lula down at that time. But this particular scandal was followed by another one called Operation Lava Jato, Operation Car Wash. And this had to do with corruption within the National Oil Company, which is a state-led company in which people were being bought off, and actually they were being given fancy cars and that kind of thing by Odebrecht. And this is one of those scandals that was sort of like an onion. You would just peel back one layer and there was always another layer underneath. And it didn't just involve Brazil, it also involved other countries. If I remember right, 2 Peruvian presidents were swept up in this scandal. It went on for very many years. A number of people received prison sentences. And in, I want to say 2016, the police raided Lula's home. as part of this scandal. And I think it was the following year, 2017, he was convicted of corruption and money laundering crimes. He wound up going to prison. I think he spent just under 2 years in prison. I think it was about 580 days, if I remember right. And the prison case itself should be a soap opera. There are more twists and turns to this case. I mean, you know, his handpicked successor president was Dilma Rousseff, was impeached. Lula was in prison, and then the case was overturned. It wound up going to the Supreme Court, I want to say in 2021. Ultimately, his conviction was overturned, which restored his political rights, which is why he could run for the presidency. And I think it's fair to say that Lula is both adored and he's also hated. And he's a polarizing figure. Like I said, he won with about 2% of the vote this time. And there's something really interesting. You know, I don't have any images in this talk, but I recently saw a map of Brazil with the vote outcomes. And it's as if someone had taken a line and they started, you know, more or less horizontally, tilted a little bit up to the northwest, and they just drawn a line through the country. And north of the country, you know, Lula is from northeastern Brazil. He had to leave with his family when he was young. He went to Sao Paulo to find work in the southeast. This is a very typical kind of migration story. He has this immense connection. I'm not quite sure how to describe it, to northeastern Brazil. Northeastern Brazil solidly voted in favor of Lula. And then you get to this line, and on the other side of the line, southeastern Brazil voted for Bolsonaro. And there's this profound cultural difference between these two parts of the country. The Northeast is less economically developed, poorer, lower education rates, more health challenges. This is Lula's base. Southeastern Brazil has financial centers. It has a higher level of economic development, better education rates, more opportunities, more people of European descent as opposed to the Northeast, where there are more people of African descent, more people of mixed race. So it's a really profound division in the country, and the country split except for the big cities. And the big cities, with one exception that I'll get to, all pretty much voted for Lula. And that's true whether you look at Manaus, the biggest city in the Amazon, or you look at Salvador, or you look at Sao Paulo. The big cities went for Lula, except, if I remember right, I think Rio de Janeiro might have held with Bolsonaro. And I have a theory about why that might be. And I want to talk about the election, and I don't think I have too much longer, but I just want to say a few words about the military, because there was a lot of discussion of, is there going to be a military coup? And I think if you know one key fact about Brazil, you can understand why I don't think a coup was ever likely. And that is that the Northeast was traditionally kind of what the American South was. It was disproportionately the source of military officers. And not only is that the case, I mean, you just have this culture of military service in the Northeast. You have people who are 8th, 9th generation military officers. Their families always been military officers. So not only are these people, this group, very common within the military, but they even have more kind of a political and cultural influence than maybe the numbers even alone might represent. Kind of, again, like the American South. So if you think about it, is there going to be a coup in Brazil when Northeastern officers would have to lead and take part in the coup and go against their home states, with which they deeply identify, against their communities and cities and families? Seems hard to picture. The other thing is that the Brazilian military is divided. From the outside, it might look united, but there's always factions. There's always military politics. And Bolsonaro might have had a majority of support in the military, but he didn't have a preponderance of power, which meant that any potential coup was going to split the military, and the military's done that, been there, not likely going to happen. So when you kind of go through all these arguments, just because something's a bad idea doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Putin had a really bad idea invading Ukraine. He still did it. But I think that whatever else you might say, the Brazilian generals have a very good sense of what the political reality is, regardless of what their personal feelings are, and that made them understand clearly that a coup was unlikely to succeed. I want to say just a little bit towards the end of this talk about the current situation. And it was interesting because it looked as though Lula had quite a lead. And then in the last couple of weeks, it really looked like Bolsonaro was gaining on him. And there was also this certain mistrust around the polls. Are the polls really accurate? Are people really saying honestly what their feelings are? So election night was quite a nail biter, but Brazil uses entirely electronic voting results. It's also interesting, it's mandatory to vote, you have to vote. And the results came in very, very quickly. And there were a few things that were important. One thing that happened was judges very quickly pushed social media companies to shut down conspiracy theories about the election online. And in the context of the United States, this I can't imagine happening because of freedom of speech, but it was acceptable in Brazil, even though Bolsonaro supporters protested. So you didn't see a lot of online, the more extreme kind of conspiracy theories really proliferating. Those were taken down. The other thing that was surprising to me personally was, even though Bolsonaro as president didn't come out and acknowledge that he had lost right away to Lula, all of his major allies, no, maybe all is too much, but many of his major allies did, which is, I think, very different from, say, the US context. And this really boxed Lula in. There were a lot of protests in the streets. And if you followed the news, you certainly have seen about information about how truckers and popular organizations have gone out and they've shut down streets and highways. But what's interesting is the elites haven't really joined that. And there's sort of this unwritten rule in Brazilian politics that Brazilian elites are very nervous about mass mobilization. And there's always been this sense, going back way more than a century, that mass mobilization is a useful tool and it's really dangerous because it undermines ultimately the power of the elites. You might kind of start something that you can't control. And that's happened before in Brazil's past with really tragic consequences. For example, if you look at a 19th century uprising in the Amazon that led to mass depopulation, the fighting was so severe, you saw an immense number of deaths in the Amazon. So there's just this mistrust. And although the elites fight amongst themselves, the one thing they can agree on is that they're really a little bit mistrustful about mass mobilization. It frightens them because they feel like it threatens their power ultimately. So it was interesting. Bolsonaro didn't give any speeches for about almost 2 days, more or less. He gave like a 2-minute speech. He didn't congratulate Lula, but he sort of recognized the protesters, but also said that we need to understand these protests need to stay inside bounds. And then pretty soon, after he left, he didn't talk to journalists. He just sort of walked away. And then I believe it was his chief of staff who came in and said, right, we're discussing the transition. And so things move ahead. And as you could have seen from the news, yes, there are still protests going on in Brazil in the streets, but I would say they're starting to sort of peter away. And at this point, the transition is going to happen. And I'm going to say just a few words about what that's likely to mean for the future in Brazil. And I'm going to start, Lula's coming to power January 1st, I want to say 2023. And there are some things that aren't going to change. For example, both Bolsonaro and Lula were not very supportive of Ukraine during this entire war. In fact, Lula has been quite critical of the president, the Ukrainian president, suggesting that he chose war, that he should negotiate more with the Russians. He feels that unlimited Western support for Ukraine is kind of dragging this conflict on. If I remember right, I think he used some analogy where Zelensky was the cherry on top of the West's cake, something like this. That's one area where I don't see a lot of change. I do see change in the sense that in terms of foreign policy, Lula is going to prioritize once again South America and relations with neighboring countries. He's going to prioritize relations with Africa. He wants to create, he has a very big dream, which his dream is to create an alternative currency to the US dollar. He feels like the region's reliance on the dollar has historically given the United States too much power. He wants to create a new currency. I'm pretty dubious that that'll go forward, but it's a priority for him, and he's certainly spoken very strongly about it. Domestically, I'm confident that he's going to move forward again with anti-poverty programs. He has spoken very strongly about needing to shut down the fires in the Amazon. The last few years have been devastating for deforestation in the Amazon. I predict that will change, and we certainly saw dramatic change during his last administrations. So I'm confident we'll see something similar. We'll probably see a focus on indigenous rights. We'll see more land restored, land claims recognized, I guess, to these communities of escaped slaves where people have lived on land for centuries, but they don't have legal title. We'll see an emphasis on LGBTQ rights. And so in some ways, I think that Brazil's future will look a lot like the period from 2003 to 2010, except that it's going to be a lot more challenging because Bolsonaro's party still is very powerful. And, you know, Lula does have a mandate, but it's a very, very thin mandate. He was only elected by a couple of %, which is going to be challenging. So I think he's, on the one hand, I don't think he faces sort of an imminent political crisis. And, you know, I've said this before, but I really do believe that Brazilian elites have this one shared common interest that they're just not, they don't like popular protests to get out of hand. They're always mistrustful of that. It's the one thing they can all agree on. And so I predict that these political protests, it's not like they're going to go away, but they're not going to expand. They're not going to threaten the transition of power. But I think that Lula is going to have a very difficult term. The last thing I'll say is that it's going to be very interesting to see. We've seen a whole series of populist leaders come to power. Some of you may have read the most recent issue of The Atlantic where there's an article about this. A lot of them seem to be one-term leaders. Not all, but generally they seem to come in and they don't seem to be reelected. It's not that they lose all power. They certainly retain a following. They don't seem to be able to translate that into second terms though. And so I think this article, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the author's name. This article in The Atlantic is really interesting because my question is, now that we've seen this with Trump, now that we've seen this with Bolsonaro, is this a trend that these leaders will come to power and have one term? So I think I want to make sure to leave enough time for questions. So I'm going to end it there, Tim.
Great. Thanks, Shawn. Fantastic perspective. Brings up a lot of points. For those who are tuned in, please put any questions you have into the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. And you sort of teed up some good questions for me there, Shawn. First of all, I want to ask, if you were a betting man, were you surprised at the outcome of this?
I was very unsure for the same reason that people are very unsure about elections here, and that people aren't always honest when they answer polls. And sometimes answers are quite a bit off. And it really did seem that Bolsonaro had a lot of momentum. And unfortunately, even within the left, there is a portion of the Workers' Party that's really kind of stepped away because of corruption scandals that have really eroded the kind of moral authority that Lula had. When you looked at Lula 15 years ago, he was the person who stood up to the military during military rule at great personal risk, and really had done a number of remarkable things. And his administration, people looked at it as kind of being a good time with low inflation rates. You know, you saw one of the things that he did that's remarkable is he actually lowered the public debt. So he had all these social programs which were very effective, and he lowered public debt. That's a pretty interesting achievement, right? So I had wondered if the corruption scandals would kind of weigh on him too much, but they didn't.
So you mentioned this, but you know, with only a 2-point percentage win, it would seem that Lula isn't necessarily coming into power, you know, with a strong mandate. So is there concern, and you touched on this a little bit, but is there concern, as we've seen in this country, that the populist base of Bolsonaro may challenge democratic process and any divergent path moving forward?
Yeah, it's going to be very difficult. What's interesting is this is in many ways very similar to a position that Lula has been in before. So on the one hand, Lula won really dramatic mandates with both of his previous elections. On the other hand, when he first came into power in 2003, he didn't have a strong following in Congress. And this particular political scandal that I mentioned with the bagman being caught with money stuffed in his underwear, that was called the Mensalão scandal. And that was because allegedly the Workers' Party was paying some congressman a monthly stipend, basically, to vote with the government so that the government could get its policies through. And this is where the entire kind of scandal that rocked his first administration came from. And here it is, it's, what's that old Yogi Berra saying, deja vu all over again, where he's coming back into power. And once again, his opponents have a very strong position in Congress. And so I think it's going to be a very challenging time for him. And what's interesting is, you know, in other contexts, you could imagine politicians kind of working across the lines. You know, I went to the Oregon Historical Society's talk just about a month ago, where we had this wonderful talk about Lyndon Baines Johnson, and it was marvelous, and his ability to kind of work with different sort of political figures and cross lines and persuade people to come to him. It's so polarized in Brazil now, much as it is in the United States. I think it's a very parallel situation. It's hard to see that happening, and I think it's going to make it very hard for him to make some of these big changes happen. I do not see, for example, him being successful to create an alternative currency in South America.
So what is Lula going to need to do to make good on his campaign promises? We all know that there's a big difference between campaigning and governing.
Yeah, the first thing that he's going to have to do is use, of course, the executive. And this is the good thing for Lula, in that it's simply enforcing the laws that are on the books. There's something that he can do without having to go through Congress, and he does have a lot of power. So for example, with Amazonian deforestation, he can enforce the laws on the books and really make a dramatic difference pretty clearly. And there's a number of sort of practical things that he can do that way that he really doesn't need Congress. And I think he's going to have to show that he's willing to move in a very big way, very quickly and dramatically, to kind of get some momentum and to satisfy his followers.
Well, so with COP27 coming up later this month, what can we expect from Brazil? And I'm thinking specifically around, you know, reversing climate policies and rainforest alliances. What do you imagine happening?
So the Workers' Party sees environmentalism as its way of kind of drawing youth into the movement. And they see it as sort of an advantage for them. And so they want to make a clear statement. And this is something where the party believes that doing something here is its own interests. It's something that's going to get it international respect, and it's something where it kind of holds the mechanisms of power where it can do something. So I think that they'll focus on the Amazon, and they'll try to make a very big statement around what they can do to protect the Amazon rainforest. And that includes continuing to turn over land to indigenous peoples.
So we've got a question from the audience. It's actually two questions. I'm gonna mash them up a little bit because they're from the same person. So Bolsonaro always seemed like a Trump mini-me. So A, is that a fair characterization? And can you speculate about Bolsonaro's political future?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, people often ask me, do you think that Bolsonaro is inspired by Trump? And I don't think so. In fact, Bolsonaro has been this way as long as he's been involved in politics, going back decades. This has been his brand. It's a very sort of parallel personality. He's very forceful. He doesn't care what the rules are. He's never been afraid of making controversy. He seems to get a genuine delight in saying things that sort of provoke people. So he's his own person. That doesn't mean he hasn't learned from watching Trump. And it's going to be very interesting. I think that Bolsonaro is likely to want to come back and run for the presidency again. So I think that he will probably haunt Lula in the same way that sort of Trump is still this figure where all the Republican leadership is kind of thinking, what is Trump doing? And he still has a lot of power. And I expect Bolsonaro to play exactly the same kind of role. So on the one hand, you do see this trend where populist figures are being voted out of office. On the other hand, they don't seem to fade away.
Well, which is interesting. I mean, we have seen some one-term ones, but then there are some figures like, I think of Orban or Erdogan, or even like a Lukashenko, and we've seen them developing networks. I mean, the fact that we saw Orban speaking, for CPAC this last year. Was Bolsonaro ever able to create, or join this network of, I don't know, global toxic populists?
Yeah, it's sort of funny, and these are kind of great counterexamples. I mean, the president of Turkey and also Orban, these are kind of the key figures. What's funny is I don't feel, and I should be cautious saying this, but I just don't feel that Bolsonaro has sort of been the same sort of rallying figure. If you look amongst political conservatives, they talk about Orban a lot, at least in the United States and also in Europe. Bolsonaro doesn't quite seem to have the same following, and it's something that sort of mystifies me. I don't know why that is the case, but he just doesn't seem to have had the same sort of position on the world stage that some other figures have. Maybe that's because of that hasn't been as much of a priority for him. He's really focused on Brazil, but it doesn't seem to be so. Yeah.
So, I mean, on that note, a number of countries in Central and South America have taken turns toward the left after years of corruption and or authoritarian rule. I mean, I'm thinking of Chile, Mexico, Peru, Colombia.
Yeah.
Are we seeing a new wave of the pink tide?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question about it that we're seeing a very powerful trend all across Latin America. You certainly saw that in the recent Colombian elections. That doesn't mean that people come in and they are always able to achieve their goals. For example, Chile had this rewritten constitution. It went to a referendum and it did not move forward. But overall, there's just been this sense of disillusionment. So we had something of a swing towards the right, and now it's a very hard swing back again towards the left, all throughout the region.
So with our own very tense election season right tomorrow, in fact, as I said earlier, make sure you all vote. We don't like to tell you what to vote for, but please vote. With our own elections happening, what could the US take away from the situation in Brazil?
Yeah, there was just yesterday, there was a wonderful article about this in the New York Times, and they interviewed a political science professor who basically said, Here in the United States, we always kind of look back to the founding fathers to kind of figure out what do we need to do in this situation, but sometimes we need to look abroad. And I think that one thing that was very helpful in Brazil is that election results came so fast. In the United States, that's often not the case, especially, you can have a state election where you're waiting for, I think the article in the New York Times said that in some states, people were waiting for a week to kind of figure out what the results were. I think having a result very quickly is very helpful, not leaving people in limbo, not leaving people wondering and kind of allowing kind of conspiracy theories to proliferate is really helpful. What's interesting is that in Brazil, they've only got electronic voting. There is no paper backup. And in fact, Bolsonaro, in the lead up to the election, was really critiquing Brazil's electronic voting system. He said that because there was no paper backup, that it was vulnerable towards fraud. But in the end, when the results came in very, very quickly, I think that really made a difference. The other thing that really made a difference is that Brazilian elites, not Bolsonaro, but a lot of elites on both sides of the spectrum had this agreement, a sort of tacit agreement that whatever the results were, they were going to recognize it. Here in the United States, you haven't seen that, for example, in a lot of leadership in the Republican Party. In Brazil, it was very different, that you saw people who were important allies of Bolsonaro, and 3, 4, 5 hours after the election, they're coming out and saying, we lost, no matter what you think about the outcome, we're going to have another chance. Let's respect the will of the voters. And so this sort of an agreement amongst the political leadership in Brazil, which has some deep historical roots, really facilitated this transition. And I do think that people in Brazil looked at the United States and said, we don't want a January 6th here. We don't want to see our country divided this way. So it's interesting, for all the divisions, for all the protests and everything else at kind of a very senior level in Congress, amongst political leadership, there was just this understanding, not only are we going to come together around the results of the election, we're going to come together across the aisle, and we're going to do it publicly, and we're going to do it fast. And I think that's something very, very different.
So you mentioned that voting is mandatory in Brazil. How do they keep that on the rails? And I mean, is there a punitive? Does something happen if people don't vote? How does this handled?
Yeah, so things may have changed since I was there, but literally it was possible to get out of voting. But if I remember right, it used to be you had to go through quite a difficult process. And if you don't vote, you are tracked. I think here in the United States, the fact whether or not we voted is tracked, of course, not our results, but whether we voted. I might be wrong about that, but certainly in Brazil it is. And if you don't vote, there's a monetary fine. It's not terribly large, but you're going to have to pay it.
Well, so we've got another question from the audience, and the question is around LGBTQ plus rights. Were LGBTQ plus rights adversely impacted under Bolsonaro, or was it more rhetoric? And what will be the impact of these rights under Lula?
Yeah, basically no legislation moved forward, and he made it very clear that he didn't care about the enforcement of the law. So the extent to which rights are violated kind of depends on whether you look on paper. On paper, some things stayed the same, but in practice, the government did not seem willing to sort of enforce the laws. That's going to change very, very quickly. I think under Lula, obviously, there was a lot of celebration in the LGBTQ community in Brazil. People are feeling very optimistic. I expect that you're going to see some very prominent LGBTQ campaigners put into senior positions fast. I think that's going to be a statement. This is very important for the Workers' Party. And I think you're going to see the government kind of keeping a very close eye, maybe looking for some opportunities to make examples basically of cases where there's been discrimination. So I think there's going to be a dramatic change.
So one last question, because we're coming up on time. What kind of dynamic do you anticipate for US-Brazil relations going forward?
Yeah. So the Brazil has a very difficult relationship, I think it's fair to say, with the United States. On the one hand, Biden right away sent a congratulatory message to Lula. And obviously there's this kind of connection between the two of them. At the same time, Brazil is pretty deeply mistrustful of the United States, which supported the 1964 coup. It turned out that President Dilma Rousseff's phone was allegedly tapped by the US intelligence services. And when the Brazilian government found out about this, it actually made noises about creating its own undersea cable for telephones that would run directly from Brazil to Europe and not pass through the United States. When countries are talking about remaking their infrastructure to cut you out of their system, you know that they are not necessarily positive towards you. And there's this sense basically in Brazil that they are the other great regional power in the Americas, and they want to have their voice and have their influence. What's interesting is not all of Brazil's neighbors are always so excited about that. If you're Bolivian, Uruguayan, Paraguayan, yeah, you might have a certain distrust. So obviously there's a political affinity between the United States and Brazil. But for example, with Lula's priority about creating an alternative currency to the US dollar, sometimes Brazil is going to try to do things that are not in the political or economic interests of the United States. So it's a complex relationship with both connections and ties, and also a lot of historical mistrust and just basically different interests sometimes, especially in the economic sphere.
Great. Well, Shawn, I really want to thank you for joining us today and shedding some great light on, what was a really exciting process to watch unfold. We have our own exciting process, of course, happening tomorrow. As I always like to remind people, we are the ones we've been waiting for. So don't forget to vote. Also coming up, as I mentioned earlier, Mel Gerthoff is speaking Thursday. That is Thursday the 10th at 6 p.m. That is an in-person event here at our headquarters on Broadway downtown in the Hatfield Room. Great book on engaging China. I didn't ask you any questions about the Chinese influence there, but that's for another program. I want to thank everyone for joining in. Thank you for your questions. More soon. Be well, be safe, and we will see you soon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for coming.